kick off by acknowledging country. We really want to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture. We want to pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'm on Gadigal land at the moment, and I know that many of you are across many, many diverse nations within the modern Australia. And then kind of turn to what we're going to be talking about this week. But before I do that, actually, I'll give you a bit of a rundown about who I am. So my name is Daniel Stone. I'm going to be facilitating today's session with 4 really, really amazing speakers. For those of you who haven't been in a session with me or met me before, I work at a company called Principal Co that does a lot of work helping people essentially run effective advocacy campaigns, and working with a number of different partners, including the Guardian, Centre for Australian Progress, Essential Media, the Community Council for Australia and the Australian Climate Foundation, have kind of created this thing called Australia at Home. Some of you may have joined us before, but for those who haven't, the idea was basically to create a meeting place during this strange time so that we can all still come together, feel connected and think about bigger ideas than just some of the more immediate stresses that the news media has been kind of getting us to think about. So some ground rules before we get the session underway. We're recording this session to share later, so if that's an issue for you, please let us know. We've got the wonderful Hannah in the chat who is going to be helping us tech support, so just let her know, or you can even message me directly, but best to do Hannah. We'll also be keeping everybody on mute while we have the conversation, basically to stop all of the background noise that we could have otherwise. But that being said, we do really, really want you to ask questions and to make this as interactive as possible. So down the bottom, you can see there's like a little chat icon. Jump in there, put your thoughts, put your questions, any ideas you have. I'll be keeping an eye on it. The other speakers will be keeping an eye on it as well. And I'll be bringing some of the simple questions forward and putting them to our panelists. And also some of the more complex questions I'll throw to you and we'll unmute you and ask you to speak. So yeah, please do use the chat and put questions in. We want it to be as interactive as humanly possible. Everyone can just watch a lecture on YouTube, but the value of doing this over Zoom is we can interact and bounce off each other. So the next thing I'm going to say is basically today's session is looking a bit more further afield than some of the ones we've done before. So as Australia starts to get out ahead of COVID-19, by no means are things here totally perfect, but it's becoming clear that Australia is in a much better position than many, many other countries, particularly many other countries within our broader Asia-Pacific region. Some of those countries are still at their earliest transmission stages. Some just don't have particularly robust healthcare systems. A whole range of issues contribute to what's going on there, which we'll hear a bit more about today. There's a big ethical question that comes with that, which is many countries have started being, a bit selfish, a bit like we need to protect our people first, which you can understand as a response. But once we start to get on top of our needs, what's our role to help those around us and what are the consequences if we don't? So to join me today, I wanted to introduce Peter Walton, who is the CEO of Care Australia, Holly Miller, the lead of the Feminist Humanitarian network. Everyone give him a wave. Peter Varghese, who's the former Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the current Chancellor of the University of Queensland, and also Josh Hallwright, who's the Humanitarian Manager at Oxfam. One thing that I forgot to mention too, which I'll just mention before I open up the first question is, if you haven't already, switch your view to the grid mode. It's that way we can see each other and all the other people who are here, and it gives you this great sense of being connected and part of a big, big room. And please do turn your video on if you haven't already as well. It's nice just to see everyone who's around. So I'm going to start with you, Peter Walton. So you run Care, which is a wonderful aid organisation started by Malcolm Fraser, as I remember, and the origin of the term care package as well, which I just is an anecdote I love. But I also know that you haven't been there for a terribly long time. So stepping into this role and taking on this responsibility, what are some of the more challenging environments that you have had to think about how to help in? Does that include like refugee camps or other locations?
Yeah, thank you, Daniel, and good afternoon. Thanks for everybody dialing in. Yeah, fascinating time to take on a new job, I have to say, because I think I often wouldn't use the term existential, but I actually think we're dealing with some existential challenges, not just in terms of responding to global problems, but also in terms of, looking at our own survival viability, given that this is an event which is impacting the whole world. I think when your question around the complex environments, you started off right at the start, Daniel, saying, here in Australia, we're in a better position than many other countries, and that's absolutely true. We have grave concerns in Care Australia that the world's poorest and some of the most vulnerable people in the world will be heavily, disproportionately impacted by COVID. So when you think about the existing vulnerabilities that exist across the whole world and some of our near neighbours, COVID compounds those existing vulnerabilities. So we have concerns around, if you take refugee camps around the world, let's take Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. 1 million Rohingya refugees are living there. There's about 40,000 refugees per square kilometre. Yet we talk about physical distancing. I think right from the outset, something is basic that we take for granted here almost now, that, the possibility of physical distancing just clearly isn't possible. When we think about refugee camps for people who have fled Syria and the violence there, CARE has done some research that demonstrates that 9 out of 10 camps don't have access to soap, or in some cases clean water. And there's often, if there are toilets at all, there's one toilet for every 240 people. So this is challenging not only existing vulnerabilities, but also the huge risk factors for if COVID takes hold in such environments. Other aspects of vulnerability, I think, which we are contending with is, we respond to natural disasters globally, but we've had a natural disaster in our own region in the last couple of weeks, a Category 5 cyclone that ripped through the Pacific, through Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, Fiji and Tonga. Normally, a Category 5 cyclone would make the news cycle. It barely caused a ripple this time. When you think about how we respond, we do promote local response first and foremost, as we should, but where extra international response is needed, we're operating in an environment of closed borders. People in countries impacted by natural disasters, normally there'd be processes around evacuation centres, and again, physical distancing and the ability to do that is heavily compromised. So our whole way of operating, and I think other colleagues on here from other international organisations, I think would probably also acknowledge that this is quite an existential change and challenge for us. Many of the countries that we seek to support are at high risk, and that COVID will absolutely compound existing vulnerabilities. And that is outside of conflict, outside of natural disasters, just in terms of some of the existing challenges that countries have. So we are also thinking about the healthcare systems in Papua New Guinea, where here in Australia, we have a very low mortality rate for COVID compared to many countries, but we also have a well-resourced and efficient and effective healthcare system. When I think about Papua New Guinea, there is one doctor for every 18,000 people. Here in Australia, the ratio is more like 1 to 280. So I guess I just wanted to paint a picture that our way of operating has had to adapt pretty quickly to try to make sure that we are able to respond to what we actually see as incredibly high risks for our near neighbours, and that we have a moral obligation more than anything else to actually try to do more, because normality will never return to Australia until there's normality more broadly. And we're all trying to do this in the context of the economic repercussions of what's happening here in Australia, where we're seeing declines in our own fundraising. So as needs go up, the support for organisations like Care Australia and others is actually under deep threat as well. So it's a very unique situation and a very unique time to be starting a new job. Thanks, Daniel.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, one little follow-up question, which I think I have a hunch about, but it's probably worth just to cover off rather directly. So when you talk about going into these communities or providing help, how does that work? Are people trying to fly over and cross closed borders, or what's the dynamic there?
So Care Australia has been pushing this concept quite heavily around locally led, or some people call localization. First responders at times of disaster are always the local community. And that's quite right. You know, when I think about tropical cyclone Pam that hit Vanuatu a few years ago, I think there were 135 international organizations, all well-intended, sought to provide support. It actually, in some cases, bypassed the local economy. So look, we've always promoted local, but I love this expression that came out of the World Humanitarian Summit a few years ago: as local as possible, as international as necessary. So we have shifted, you know, our focus around really trying to make sure that we're supporting local capacity, local decision making, local disaster readiness, so that ability to deal with any crisis is fundamentally locally led. I think where it's a challenge is, especially in the context of COVID, you know, there is often still the need for international support. There is the need for international supplies frequently, and that is all compromised at the moment. You know, borders are closed, commercial flights to provide technical specialists to provide assistance heavily restricted. There is an opening of a humanitarian corridor, but there are real concerns around this given the uncharted territory that we're in. So certain supplies, for example, which are being dispatched, and we're working closely with the Australian government to use Australian Defence Force planes and so forth, we're still facing issues of essential supplies needing to go into quarantine. So it's a heavily compromised scenario at the moment.
Fantastic, or not fantastic rather, it sounds like extremely complex, but thank you for that answer. One thought just before I pose my question, my next question is, if any of that is triggering thoughts or questions for you, do let us know what they are, because I think once we've kind of heard from each of the speakers, we really like to draw questions from the crowd. But Peter Varghese, I just wanted to ask you a question. So you've had a lot of experience at a diplomatic level and a bit of insight about how governments might actually approach their thinking on something like this. What do you think the geopolitical impact of COVID is likely to be, especially in our region?
Well, thank you very much, Daniel, and good afternoon to everyone. So look, I think the middle of a crisis is probably the worst time to try and make judgments about the longer term ramifications of what we're dealing with. And broadly, my view has always been that crises accelerate forces that were already at play rather than create completely novel dynamics. But that said, I think there are some things we can already say about the direction in which we're heading. The first is that I think the most serious consequences from COVID are going to be the medium and long-term economic consequences, because for every country dealing with this, they have gone through a deliberate economic shutdown, and different countries are at different stages of that. But the cumulative effect of it is going to be a very deep economic downturn, which could well be very prolonged. I think it's safe to say that we haven't seen anything like that, or won't see anything like that, since probably even before the Great Depression. Now, there's a lot of argument about whether we'll end up with a V-shaped recovery, a U-shaped recovery, a bathtub-shaped recovery, who knows? I think it's all a bit early to say. But severe economic dislocation has a lot of consequences in an ecosystem. Not only will it seriously downgrade growth, and if you're looking at the development agenda, the downgrading of growth is probably the single biggest blow to poverty alleviation that any developing country will face. In some countries, I think it will lead to quite significant social tensions and domestic instability. I think what we're seeing at the moment is the complete ineffectualness of the multilateral system. I mean, the striking thing about the COVID crisis up to now is that here is a classic problem with no borders, and yet there has been virtually no effective multilateral response to it. The G20 has done nothing more than endorse national actions. Regional institutions, whether it's the EU or ASEAN, have been largely powerless, and even the international organizations whose bread and butter it is to deal with this, I think, haven't covered themselves with glory. So the deterioration, the weakening of the multilateral system, which was evident before COVID, I think has been highlighted. Now, part of that, I think, is just the geopolitical rivalry, which is underpinning a lot of the global outlook at the moment, and most notably the US-China relationship, and the way in which that has limited what can be done on a broader multilateral frame. Secondly, the sort of rise of sovereignty protection as the sort of touchstone of politics in so many countries. And while the scale of that may differ, it's a thread that's running through more and more countries, including in Europe, certainly in the United States, and it has some echoes in Australia as well. So I think what all of this adds up to is the countries closest to us are going to be tested in a way they haven't been tested before, because what COVID does is it highlights weaknesses in state capacity, whether that's weaknesses in your health systems or weaknesses in your government's capacity to deliver services. And we're living in a region where those weaknesses are, I think, quite deep. We're not in a region of failed states, but we're in a region where there are a number of fragile states, and particularly in the South Pacific. So whether you're dealing with Indonesia, which is a very large country with limited state capability, or the smaller Pacific Island countries where health services are under a lot of strain, how to strengthen state capacity at a time of economic weakness, and how to get economic growth going back into so many of these countries is going to be, I think, the very large challenge ahead of us, and it'll have implications for what Australia does. We've got an aid program which is contracting both in real terms as well as geographically. I think we'll probably see an acceleration of the latter. In other words, there will be more of a COVID focus and a Pacific focus, and that means we'll be doing less in Southeast Asia. And my own view is that would be unfortunate if that were the result, but I think that's the trend that's heading our way. I might leave it there.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. We have a really good question from Phoebe in the chat, and I might actually ask you, Phoebe, to kind of pose that question if you can.
Yes, sure. Thank you very much. I was just wondering, Peter, if you see the collapse of the multilateral system as being a threat to the realisation of the Sustainable Development Goals, and if so, and well, the Sustainable Development Goals, the eradication of poverty, and even to international peace and security. And within that frame, so what should Australia be doing, and what should organisations like Care Australia be doing to try to provide some sort of buffer or foundation to that multilateral system?
Yeah, thanks, Phoebe. Look, I think it's very much a threat to our Sustainable Development Goals, because in order to achieve those goals, I think you need a level of multilateral cooperation as well as an international system which is conducive to economic growth. And what we're seeing is both of those strands are going to be considerably weaker going into the next 3, 4 or 5 years. What can we do about it? Well, unfortunately, you can't completely separate the effectiveness of multilateral cooperation from the state of great power relationships, and I don't see that attenuating in the near to medium future. That's going to put a bigger burden, I think, on other states, particularly middle powers, but not just middle powers, to try and put together coalitions which can try and either retrieve some of the damage that's being done to the broader multilateral system, or create an environment where they're able to achieve things which may be short of what you would get under a fully operational multilateral system, but which is better than the collapse that we're beginning to see. So I think the idea of coalitions of the willing, the idea of bringing together both regionally and beyond countries that are interested in continuing to try and deal with global problems from a global perspective, that's going to be much more important. And, you know, for Australia, ultimately, we are, as a country, very dependent on multilateral effectiveness, because the alternative to a rules-based system is the law of the jungle. And when you can neither buy nor bully your way in the world, if you're a country like Australia, that's not a very enticing prospect.
Thanks for that, Peter. I might now go to Holly as well. So, Holly, you have had a very interesting kind of career working both in this sector, but very recently have come back from Jordan, which I found very exciting. Could you tell us a little bit about like the gendered impacts of the crisis, specifically, you know, if you can, tying to your time in the Middle East, but not necessarily if you've got broader perspectives, and like what can we do to try and address some of those challenges?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Daniel. So I think the gendered impacts of COVID-19, I mean, there's a long list of them, but the first and perhaps most obvious is the significant increase that we've seen in domestic violence, hugely increased levels of it in Australia, but also around the world, and how that's kind of managed in various contexts, both in the Middle East and in other countries, given lockdown and given how different countries have managed lockdown. Just yesterday, I was on a webinar with ActionAid Australia, actually, who were talking about their work in the camps in Jordan, where I've obviously just come from working, and they were sharing that, you know, the curfew in Jordan has been particularly severe, and that's really been commended in terms of the health impacts. But given that that people aren't really allowed to leave their homes, that has a huge impact for women living in refugee camps. And so there's a lot of work to be done still to ensure that the gendered impacts, including domestic violence, are being responded to. So, as I say, domestic violence is a really obvious one. In addition to that, there's huge increases in women's unpaid care work. Obviously, with having the whole family at home, that gendered role that women have of being responsible for caring for the home really increases, and it does too when people get sick in their family as well. And that then has flow-on effects, psychological impacts. The stress that women experience is significant. And then, of course, another issue that a number of organisations around the world have raised is, you know, a real nervousness around critical services that have been funded that protect women's rights, like sexual and reproductive health services, having funding diverted to respond to the broader health crisis. And so, yeah, I guess these broader questions around funding for protective services are something that we're really concerned about at the Feminist Humanitarian Network. And perhaps before I go on, I can just share very quickly that the Feminist Humanitarian Network is an international network of organisations, and particularly we've got 70% of the organisations that belong to the network are women's rights organisations working in local and national contexts in the Global South. And then 30% international organisations that support those organisations. So I know Peter earlier spoke about localisation, and that's really something that we push as well. But beyond that, we're really focused on ensuring that those women's rights organisations that are working on the front lines of this response in the Middle East and well beyond are recognised. So I just kind of wanted to say that first and foremost, because I think a lot of what I have to share really are messages from those women's rights organisations working around the world, and I just wanted to make sure that they were represented in this conversation. So I'll just kind of move on to, in terms of what the sector can be doing to respond to those gendered impacts. I think firstly, something that really needs to be said is that right now is actually a really good time to be thinking about the humanitarian system and to think about how we as an international community respond to a humanitarian crisis. And obviously, the other Peter talked a little bit about the systems globally at the moment that are at play or that are being challenged. And I would say that the humanitarian system is one that we need to be thinking about very, very closely and really have as a priority in our minds. We really need to be looking at, yes, what's working and what isn't. And at the Feminist Humanitarian Network, we would say that the international humanitarian system, so that's donor governments, international organisations like UN agencies, national governments, international NGOs, and the systems and processes that are in place to coordinate humanitarian action is deeply patriarchal. So we know, and this has been said in this conversation earlier too, that crises amplify existing inequalities. This is something we're seeing now in Australia and around the world. And we also know that crises have gendered impacts. This is not new. This is not something new that we're seeing in COVID-19 that we haven't seen time and time again. So I guess what I would say is that we need a humanitarian system that recognises the gendered impacts of crisis and is committed to addressing them. And beyond that, we need a system that's committed to using the opportunity presented by a crisis. So when those things start to break down, to drive change at a structural level in order to advance the rights of all people, and particularly women and marginalised groups. Something we're really concerned about, in addition to those gendered impacts of the crisis, is that the humanitarian response itself will have a detrimental impact on women's rights organisations and the critical work that they've been doing well before COVID-19 and the advancements that they've made towards achieving justice and equality in their communities. So we know, as I said earlier, that women's rights organisations are really leading efforts in the response at the moment, and that local efforts are very much what we're relying on. And those organisations have been responding since there was really just a whisper of this pandemic. But they're not funded often, and they're not recognised by the international humanitarian community, and they're often excluded from those critical coordination meetings, and their voices aren't heard when, you know, a lot of their thinking and their insights are extraordinarily strategic. And so I guess we're concerned that those women's rights organisations are going to be undermined through the response, and that's going to be a huge problematic impact of this. So yeah, I guess that's my main point. We really want to be looking at the humanitarian system and ensuring that it is working in a feminist way, so that nobody is left behind by this response.
Yeah, thanks, Holly. I think that is extremely grounding. I guess, and I appreciate that was like functionally a systems response. One thing that I did want to ask, if I can indulge my own curiosity, is when you were looking at you know, the context in Jordan, what have you heard is happening there? Like, what does this look like in the Middle East more specifically? Because I feel like one of the challenges we've had is, ever since people aren't really able to go outside anymore, our ability to see what's happening in other countries and other communities is very limited. Have you got any insight on that from your time there?
Yeah, and probably more so from people that I'm still in touch with having left, because I think we left just before everything started to get really serious, so the timing was quite funny. But yeah, I guess what we're hearing, so Jordan has taken a really strong approach to the COVID-19 response. So Jordan kind of, I think as early as the 14th of March, said, look, no more flights in and no more flights out. So that was well before a number of other nations around the world. And at that time too, they shut down all schools, they shut down all mosques, they stopped people from gathering altogether, even at weddings and funerals. So there has been a really, really strong response. And then within all of that, there have actually been total lockdowns. So at the first one, I think, was 4 or 5 days and nobody was allowed to leave their home at all. And then in the middle of that, there was a drop by the army, I believe, of essentials, door-to-door bread and milk. And so I think that that presented its challenges, but in many ways was, you know, by many was commended for having been so strong, particularly recognising that Jordan has huge refugee camps, and that kind of stopping the spread into those camps is really critical. But friends of mine have said, you know, it kind of feels a bit like a village. So since those lockdowns, people are now allowed out for essentials as they are here. But another interesting thing that Jordan has done is to say that you can't drive in Amman anyway. So people are all walking to the shops to get their groceries. And this friend of mine was saying, you know, it really feels like a village. It's something really nice about it actually, but it's quite a strange time there as it is everywhere, I guess.
Yeah, I can imagine. Thank you for that. I might now turn to Josh. So as I think Peter Walton mentioned at the start, this isn't the only crisis happening right now. We've had a hurricane go through the Pacific. There's lots and lots of other things that have either happened recently as natural disasters or conflicts, as well as really established things that have been running for a really long time. This is clearly the only one capturing our attention, though. So what are the consequences of COVID on top of all these other things happening?
Significant, to say the least. So firstly, I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land on which we all meet and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And noting, picking up on some of the previous comments, these are the times where we see those inequalities widen, and things like Oxfam and others Close the Gap report. These are the reasons we're seeing in these times of crisis, the reasons for that ongoing advocacy and preparedness work to try and reduce that inequality so that people's rights are maintained in normalcy, or new normalcy, as we're going to emerge into, as well as during crises. I think there's countless examples of existing crises around the world that are currently underfunded. I mean, I'm doing my PhD in humanitarian finance, and so over the last 10 years, we see that the funding for humanitarian crises around the world hasn't moved. It's usually about 60% of what's actually required. And that's still the case now with COVID-19, adding an additional ask on the humanitarian system. So echoing much of Holly's points and other colleagues that we do need to do things differently. And we see that the first such case and the first sort of tangible case I had recently was before TC Harold. There was some flash flooding in Dili in Timor-Leste, that some people may know of. Affected 30,000 people, wiped away a lot of houses. But some of the government agencies working alongside some of the NGOs there, Oxfam included, wouldn't go out and provide assistance to those homes that have been destroyed because of the fear of COVID-19. So that fear and that public perception of the virus and some of the misinformation is having a very real impact on a range of humanitarian crises and communities experiencing those, obviously, which is adding another layer of complexity onto existing complexities.
That makes a lot of sense. I might actually, Nina, I will not even attempt to pronounce your surname, I'm sorry, I don't want to, but I might call to you actually, because you had an interesting question about Africa.
Yes, it's about WHO has just put out an article that I read yesterday, I think, about 30 million people in Africa will be pushed into extreme poverty as a result of the pandemic. And I'm sure that most of you agree that it's easier to deal with the pandemic now and assisting in the developing countries in Africa, rather than dealing with a large-scale humanitarian crisis. But how do we get that message across to politicians, to people on the street, and who do we need to get it across to?
Yeah, Josh, that's for you.
Okay. So yeah, I think it's a great question, and with such diversity in a continent like Africa, with 54 different countries and such diverse communities, languages, etc., and current context, some very developed countries, some that are really struggling through conflict for years. I think it's a really important question. And I think that it comes back to things like these mechanisms, these fora, to raise the profile of some of those crises, existing and emerging. So one of the things, recently I just got a situation update from South Sudan, is that interestingly, they haven't gone the lockdown route, but as people are familiar with the context over there, there's an existing peace accord, a peace agreement, and there's very real fears currently because of some of the fear around COVID-19 and some of the restrictions that are starting to emerge on movement between provinces, some of the restrictions on essential goods, for example, flights in and out and the like, that there's a very real risk that the peace agreement falls apart. And thus massive ongoing civil war to break out again. I think it's on organisations like Oxfam and colleagues in the sector to raise awareness of this. It's on the Australian public to be interested. And it's also on the Australian government and the business community that are engaged in overseas work to try and support the efforts to raise awareness of the complexity of these issues, not forget forgotten crises. Very few people in Australia, for example, are aware that in West Africa, we're looking at 50 million people on the verge of famine now. And that's twice Australia's population without enough to survive. Central African Republic, the list goes on. So yeah, it's very much on us collectively to use every mechanism possible to raise the profile of emerging crises and existing crises, and to get the support to do that, financial and sort of moral support to be able to respond to these crises in different parts of the world.
And Josh, just on that, just a follow-up question from me. So with those kind of resources questions, are you functionally asking, like, is this a government role? Is this small donors across the community? Who is that asked to?
Both. And I can pass to Peter after that. So I think Oxfam has just launched a specific COVID-19 humanitarian funding appeal, and that's very much aimed at the Australian public to try and raise resources and mobilise public support for many parts of the world that don't have the luxuries that we have here, or that the majority of us have here in Australia with the public health system that we do and the response to date. But there's also a need for large resources from the Australian government and the international community. So Oxfam's called on the Australian government to pay its fair share into the global humanitarian appeal to support struggling countries, and that's only $84 million compared to the domestic stimulus, which I think is $160 billion and counting. But also for debt relief and an investment in, so debt relief for the most heavily indebted countries, and that's very much a government and intergovernment responsibility or possibility that they can do, as well as setting up funds to get money into people's hands as fast as possible so that they can survive this. And to pick up on Holly's points, women are by far the most heavily involved in the informal economy. And so what Oxfam's calling, amongst other things, is for a fund to be set up internationally to support cash grants to female-headed households and women's rights organisations to continue that advocacy work and to make sure that women and their families have enough resources to survive.
That makes sense. And Peter, Walton, you wanted to jump into?
I did just want to build on a couple of things that both Josh and Holly had said. There was a question around, dealing with the challenges of today. compounded by COVID. Africa was cited. I think there was an earlier question around, why aren't we doing more in PNG now? I think we've got a challenge between sort of the short term and the immediate and the longer term. So in terms of the short term, Care Australia, many organisations, and in fact the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade is immediately trying to pivot programs to provide some form of COVID, either preparedness or response. Has to be done in a way, to build on Holly's point, that we don't undermine or increase risk in other areas such as sexual and gender-based violence and so forth. But I think the question also goes to that broader reform agenda. What Josh was talking about in terms of, on average, us having about 60% of the required financing to deal with the humanitarian crises that we deal with today, that is an average shortfall of 40% across the world. But that's dealing with today's challenges. And yet, most people would be aware that, when we think about climate change, we are forecasting a planet that's going to be 1.5 degrees warmer within the next 10 years and all of the consequences of that. We've been thinking about the risk of pandemic for a long time, and it's upon us now. But we also have to think about the very high risks of antibiotic resistance moving forward. We are seeing increasing frequency, intensity of natural disasters and more people on the move fleeing conflict than at any other point since the Second World War. So, I would build on the comments that we need sort of quite systematic reform of the humanitarian system more broadly if we have any hope of actually dealing with today's challenges, let alone those that we're anticipating in the future. So there does have to be some fundamental shifts because it is ill-equipped to deal with the challenges despite all of the good intents of every organisation involved in this space. Shifting power in terms of local capacity is clearly one. Localisation isn't about funding, it's actually about shifts in power. But actually doing more to reduce risk and actually taking fundamental steps to reduce the risks that exist, whether that's in the health security space or whether it's in reducing risk around disasters. We actually have a system that is largely skewed to response and largely skewed towards quite a fragmented response. So I think there is a call, a wake-up call for quite radical reform in terms of being better prepared to meet future needs.
I think that makes a lot of sense and touches on a comment you made at the very start of our conversation about the kind of financial impacts on your organisations. And I guess I wanted to explore on that a little bit more. So you're talking a bit about some of the systems and work effects and the stakes that we're facing if organisations aren't well resourced. But I guess what I'm curious to know is, when it comes to your organisations, what has the impact looked like financially, and in material terms, what does that mean you're not able to do? Like, does that mean you've had to let staff go, or you've had to cut projects back out? Like, I'm interested to know a bit more about what that looks like. Yeah, I'll go to you, Peter, and then I think Josh is keen to jump in on that as well.
So look, I think we're in the early stages. I think there's two elements to this. We have done forecasting and are experiencing an immediate hit on fundraising. Many organisations in this space rely on face-to-face fundraising, people that you see on the streets. That is paused for obvious reasons. But the economic uncertainty facing Australians is also being played out in terms of support to organisations. Australians are incredibly generous, but during really tough times, clearly there's a flow-on impact, and we're seeing that. So, so we're dealing with that in the short term. But I think the broader issue, and it goes to a point that Peter Varghese made right at the start, the longer term, the medium term to longer term implications of this are sort of largely unknown, but the trajectory is pretty clear that there is likely to be a significant decline in support, public support to all organisations, and that the flow-on effect of that is, we have to make very difficult choices around what we can and can't support, even at a time when the demand for our services is increasing rapidly.
Yeah, do you have a comment on that as well, Josh?
Yeah, just to just very quickly on the funding gap, because I think it's relevant, that the funding ask for humanitarian crisis is, to pick up on Peter's point around great nation rivalry, it's the amount that the US and China spend on ice cream every year. That figure is all that the humanitarian system is asking to literally save the lives of 110 million people a day. So just to give you, in terms of comparative, And so, yeah, equally reflecting Peter's comments that the COVID crisis is impacting Oxfam as it is across the sector from a public perspective, and people have and continue to be incredibly generous. We've had people doubling their donations, for example, with the recognition that these are very trying times. And I think hopefully as we continue here domestically to flatten the curve, and the economy will hopefully pick back up again in the coming months, we have the opportunity to re-engage with the global issues, global concerns, the world at large. And equally, I think it would be remiss of us not to mention the Australian government's continued decline of funding NGOs, humanitarian, and much broader the aid writ large. And so I think that these are moments where we see the real value add of the NGO sector vis-a-vis multilaterals, as Peter picked up on before, but also that there is a greater need for more institutional funding from the Australian government to pay our fair share in supporting people that have much less and are in much greater need than Australians.
Thanks, Josh. I might try and get everyone to move through questions a bit fast so we can fit a few in, because there's a bit of a backlog, which is great. But I also think that that one point you ended on is really worth emphasising, which is that the federal government, particularly under the Abbott, Turnbull and Morrison administrations have absolutely gutted it, foreign aid, and it's a real travesty. I think next we're going to go to Dylan, who has a question for Holly.
So Holly, cool. Sorry, forgot to start the video. Holly, Dylan here from Oxfam as well. I've visited the Zatari camp for Syrian refugees in Jordan before. And am I right that humanitarian staff are no longer able to access that camp and some of the other big camps in Jordan? And what sort of challenges is that creating both in Jordan and around the world to allow humanitarians to keep supporting people like the Syrian refugees to get the aid they need, but also respond to any outbreak?
So on the camps in Jordan, I mean, that's something I had heard at first as well, but speaking to a friend there who coordinates a lot of humanitarian work, we had heard that some humanitarian agencies are being given access still. So I think some humanitarian workers are going into the camps in Jordan. And in terms of access in other contexts, so, if we look at refugee camps in Kenya, if we look at refugee camps in Lebanon, I emphasised earlier that local women's rights actors are leading the response, and that's certainly true in those camps. So I know, one of the organisations we work with in Kenya has a number of the women in the host community are working in a humanitarian capacity in the camp and have remained in that space where they're providing support and humanitarian assistance with then external support from the national agency outside. And that's the same thing we're seeing in Lebanon as well, where a number of women-led organisations who were working in the camps previous to the COVID outbreak are still working in the camps, but they've changed or just upscaled their response. So I think, again, the point about local actors and about women-led women rights organisations is another one that I would emphasise there, that there are people there, they are doing the work. And, when we're talking about support and funding, I think a key way that we can be ensuring that people are receiving support is to make sure that those actors are getting support to continue those efforts.
Yes. Thank you. I might, while we've got our attention on you, Holly, Ellie had a question too about how funding kind of moves. So, Ellie, do you want to pose your question?
Yeah, Holly, it was just around how potentially we could support local women's organisations, whether it's through the Feminist Humanitarian Network, or have you seen other avenues, like Josh was talking about with Oxfam? Are there avenues for that for local women's organisations?
Yeah, sure. So firstly, absolutely, we can talk about supporting the Feminist Humanitarian network. But I guess there are a number of channels, and I think financially INGOs are working with women's rights organisations, and I think that, you know, kind of giving to those INGOs that put priority there is something that you can do. So in our network, we have a number of INGO members, and the Australian ones include, I think, might just be ActionAid is a member of the Feminist Humanitarian Network. But you can, I guess, look at INGOs that prioritise women's rights and that work with women's rights organisations and support those NGOs. I guess the other thing is that we really want to get this message out there, and I know that this is something that we're all doing throughout this response, but I think it's really important for the women's rights organisations to be heard, and for governments and those international donors to be giving to those organisations, prioritising them, and not just resourcing them, but making room for them at the decision-making table and following their guidance. And so if we can all kind of make an effort to share their voices, to kind of seek out what they have to say about what's happening in their communities, and then taking action to kind of share that in online spaces and to talk about it, then perhaps we can start to shift the narrative and shift the priorities of donors who are funding humanitarian efforts.
Thank you, that makes a lot of sense. I might now throw back to Peter Varghese if we can, and there's a really interesting and very thoughtful question from Misha Coleman at the Global Health Alliance. Misha, do you want to pose your question?
Yeah, thanks very much, Daniel. I guess my question was to Mr. Varghese in terms of his, comments about multilateral organisations. And Peter, I don't know, the extent to which you were, which multilats you were talking about, but we work a lot with Gavi, the Global Vaccine Alliance. And I guess I just sort of wonder, from your background with foreign affairs, how, and, the regional health security issues, that have been highlighted by COVID, but what do you think is the sort of horizon in a shrinking ODA budget, but already we're seeing outbreaks of measles and polio because of the cessation or the interruption in regular immunisation rollout?
Yeah, thanks, Misha. Look, unfortunately, I don't see much prospect in terms of the envelope for Australian aid funding expanding significantly. I mean, it's been on a declining trajectory, and in real terms, that's continuing, because I don't think even the CPI adjustments are necessarily locked in. And considering we're going to be moving into a much tighter fiscal situation as a result of all of the government intervention and spending, I think it's unlikely that we're going to see that trajectory turned around. So that means that Australia's contributions to global and regional health initiatives are going to remain, I think, roughly at best at the level that they are now. In terms of COVID itself, of course, there's quite a lot of activity going on which isn't necessarily funded from Australian government coffers in relation to vaccine development. And certainly my university, UQ, is very well advanced, and I suppose one of about 6 or 7 of the key contenders globally for finding a vaccine. But the funding base for that tends to be more through organisations like CEPI, which admittedly does have quite a bit of European government contributions to it, but then also philanthropic ventures like the Gates Foundation. And I think one of the great things that the Gates Foundation has been doing on the COVID front is trying to shorten the time frame for the distribution of vaccines by addressing the manufacturing capability even before the trials have received all of their approvals. And I don't think that's been done previously for the development of any vaccine. And I think it just shows, I think quite a smart way of thinking about that, so that you don't lose absolutely precious time in the gap between lengthy trials and then tooling up and engineering up your vaccine production facilities.
Thanks, Peter. That makes a lot of sense. I also might just quickly throw to Emma Bull as well, who had a follow-up, or vaguely connected question as well.
Thanks, Daniel. Sorry, I don't have very good audio, but Peter, for you again, just it's okay. Just following on from your opening remarks about the impact on the multilateral system, are there any other trends or longer-term impacts you can see for the aid and development budget and work over time, and perhaps if there were lessons learnt for the sector or for the department from previous health crises like these that you've seen?
Yeah, I think the big difference between this health crisis and what we've dealt with in the past is that the consequence is going to run much longer and much deeper, even after the health issue has been dealt with. So, let's assume at some point we come out of the COVID crisis, and let's assume that at some point we'll have an effective vaccine, and the health challenge can be managed. Even after we get to that point, what we're going to have to deal with are these, absolutely staggering economic consequences that will flow for probably several years. So in that respect, I think we are in quite uncharted waters with COVID compared to a number of the other health crises that we've had.
Thanks, Peter. I think we're getting dang on close to time. So what I might do is I might just say to all of our speakers, I'm going to do a bit of wrap up, but can you guys have a think about what's something that you have seen within the international aid sector or within the work of INGOs over the last few weeks that's made you think, oh, this is why I'm here. This is something that makes me really proud and really happy. I think that it's easy to get caught up with all of the drudgery and the anxiety while we're thinking about how to solve problems in the future. But I also really want to take some time to put some light on those special moments. While you're thinking about that, I also just want to say thank you all for coming, both our four wonderful speakers and also everyone who's come along to listen today. I think it's been a really incredibly interesting conversation, and I admit I was a little bit nervous to have a whole bunch of different speakers, but I actually think you've really each offered a really different perspective, and one that's really enriching, and that I'm sure you all in the audience have really enjoyed hearing as well. We will also be sending out a feedback sheet to everyone who attends after this is finished. So please do fill that out. It's only a couple of minutes. I know that, those sort of things seem a bit administrative, but they really help us get a sense of what's working, what isn't, and help us fine tune and refine in the coming days and weeks. We've already taken a whole bunch of speaker suggestions from that and retuned how we do some of the agendas for the sessions. So yeah, we are actively looking at them and responding. Next week as well, I'm just going to give you a quick rundown. We've got a really exciting and really big week ahead of us next week. So we've got a really interesting session about gambling in the time of coronavirus on Monday, which brings in the wonderful people from the Gambling Reform Alliance. I may have gotten those words around the wrong way, but as well as a couple of other different organisations working in that space, which are doing fantastic work. On Tuesday, we have the Political Geek Fest, which is where Peter Lewis and Catherine Murphy come together to go through the most recent Essential Report and also just talk about what's happening in politics that week. Then on Wednesday, we've got a session that I am personally extremely excited about, which is Dan Pfeiffer, the host of Pod Save America and a former senior advisor to Barack Obama, is going to be joining us and talking about what's happening over in the US and what what they're going to be trying to do to solve those problems, and kind of what we can do from afar. So that's very excited about that. Then on Thursday and Friday, we've got some other very exciting events, which I foolishly didn't write down, but they are coming and they're going to be great. Now, just to conclude, so I might go back through the speakers in the order that we started with. So Peter Walton, like what made you feel like happy and encouraged over the last few weeks?
I think two things. It's about care people. You know, the ability to adapt not only their own personal circumstances, but to keep focused on our mission and keep focused on delivering despite these very unusual times. And in an additional way to that, also recognizing that COVID, for all of the challenges that it is presenting to us, actually also offers some opportunity for radical rethinks. And actually embracing that, I think I've been hugely encouraged by.
Wonderful. Peter Varghese.
Thanks. Well, I guess my perspective is a little bit different in the sense that I'm not as involved on the ground as some of the others on the panel. But look, I think some of the spontaneous grassroots community responses to helping the community get through this period has been very encouraging. I mean, obviously, you know, governments play a very big role on the big macro issues, but when you look at the way in which community groups have got together to either sort of make sure that vulnerable people or people who are in difficulty are able to get supplies, you know, visits, aged care facilities. I mean, just that sense of community, which I think has probably been enhanced in the COVID period, has been very encouraging. The other thing, which is more at the government and the community level, is that we are approaching this thing a little bit differently in that we're trying to build in some longer term thinking about what this all means and how we deal with it, whether it's the setting up of the commission or in other projects. And for someone who's long been worried about the short-termism of government in Australia and elsewhere, that's an encouraging development.
Absolutely. What about you, Holly?
I guess I've been in a lot of late night and very early morning calls with kind of women from all over the world, and it's been amazing. Just, I don't know, I guess a lot of those barriers that a lot of us have up most of the time have kind of broken down as a result of all working together in this response. And it's been really wonderful to be in those conversations where women from Palestine will share a challenge that they've been having, and women from Liberia will give them advice and then share a challenge they've been having, and just how much solidarity, I think, and openness and kind of personal engagement that that we're seeing kind of between women. And I know that's happening in other communities all over the world as well. So I guess, yeah, that solidarity and that closeness and that sense of working together.
Yeah, that's definitely been something I've observed as well. And to close out, Josh, what is what you a sense of positivity over the last few weeks?
To echo the previous statements around how amazing people are during times of crisis and the resilience that people show. I think, lastly, that these kind of crises, I think, will become more regular and I think, and more impactful. And so what I've been really excited about lately is the opportunities for change and the ability to, if people just want to radically rethink how we work as a society, then it's possible. Who would have thought that a coalition government coming off the back of intense bushfire season would effectively implement a universal basic income, have free childcare and a whole range of other quite left-leaning socialist policies. So I'm really excited about what that means for the world and what kind of change that we could all collectively enable.
That is also very inspiring and a wonderful, wonderful note to end both this session and the week on. So thank you again to the amazing speakers. I will give you an applause from here, and I encourage everyone else to do that. And thank you to everyone who's come along as well. I think I really appreciate your contributions, and I think it really helped draw out some really interesting conversation. So thanks very much, and have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much. Bye.